Thank you, Dan and Hannah, first of all, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series. I'm really thrilled to be part of that and to be alongside Fehras today. I also would like to start with a very short statement of solidarity with Palestinian people and with Palestine today. I think especially as we discuss the history of Arabic publishing, we cannot but pay tribute to the wealth of knowledge that Palestinian intellectuals have produced, and that will be very apparent, in fact, in my presentation. There's also a coincidence that on this day, 25 May 2000, Israeli forces withdrew from Lebanon after decades of brutal military occupation. Today, we commemorate Lebanon's liberation, and we can only hope that the day will also come when Palestine will be free. All right, so just my presentation today will draw from my new book, Cosmopolitan Radicalism, but I will focus specifically on publishing in it. But just before I go into the publishing, I just want to give a brief summary of the book. So Cosmopolitan Radicalism explores the intersections of visual culture, design, and politics in Beirut from the late 1950s to the mid-1970s. At the time, Beirut developed as a nodal city of transnational Arab artistic encounter, intellectual debate, and political contestation, which was marked by anti-colonial struggle and complicated by a Cold War order. The book uncovers the transnational circuits that animated Arab modernist pursuits and sheds light on the forgotten trajectories and graphic design practices of its protagonists, Egyptian, Iraqi, Lebanese, Palestinian, and Syrian artists who wove through Beirut in and out of its flourishing art galleries, publishing industry, and political movements. Drawing on forgotten archives of everyday printed media or printed matter, the book reveals the translocal visuality that emerged with and crucially shaped Beirut's development as a nodal city in the global 60s. Central to this nodal configuration was the rise of Beirut as a node of transnational Arabic publishing. My investigation centers the visuality and materiality of Arabic publications as important sites of aesthetic experimentation and as reproducible and mobile artifacts of print culture. The visuality of such Arabic printscapes helped articulate political imaginaries, mobilize cross-border identifications, and shape aesthetic sensibilities. So here in the book, basically, I explore changes in the design and form of Arabic cultural periodicals and books in the context of a network of new relations between modern Arab art and literature, offset printing technologies, the economy of transnational Arabic publishing, and the cultural politics of Arab decolonization. So in this presentation, I will show some of the key examples of publishing during that time and briefly discuss some of the issues I've just mentioned now. And just before I show the example, I think there's an important note to be done on the archives here, the publishing archives. And I want to say here that I'm drawing from, for this presentation, mostly on a private collection of Aboudi Boujoude, who I think is with us today. And just to say that I've been working with Aboudi for more than 10 years now to build a collection of Arabic illustrated publications, books, and periodicals. So it's important to mention where do these archives sit. They're in Beirut now with Aboudi. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please, Dan? If we can. Yes, thank you. So I'm going to begin with Hiwar. Hiwar was a prominent cultural periodical or magazine, or Hiwar means dialogue in Arabic, that was founded in 1962 and edited by the Palestinian modernist poet Tawfiq Sayegh. It was a short-lived Beirut-based Arabic periodical that was, for those who don't know, connected to a global network of similar journals that were intellectually and financially administered by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And this revealed to be a covert CIA global operation, and one of the most important and long-standing US cultural campaigns during the Cold War, by which the US countered communist visions with its own capitalist models model of democracy and liberal conception of individual freedom. Or this is what scholars have identified as a cultural Cold War, but also as a Cold War modernism. So the controversy surrounding Hiwar is well known. However, the journal itself, the modernist discourse it foregrounded, and its visual and material form has not received the attention, or at least the scholarly attention it deserves. In particular, Hiwar forged an aesthetic nexus between literary and visual arts, providing an important platform for modern Arab art on its pages. And in fact, it was a pioneer in doing so. And in doing so, it actually became itself a node of transnational modernism within the Arab world. And every issue, as you'll see from the slides, what the covers show, every issue featured a different artist from a modern artist from the Arab world, was introduced on the cover, and had also a series of artwork represented or reproduced inside on the pages. Also, it had Waddah Faris, who was the actual graphic designer for the magazine. Waddah Faris is an artist and graphic designer. Later, is more known as a prominent gallery owner. So he was the art director of Hiwar. And so the contributions, can we go to the next slide, please, Dan? So the contributions inside the actual magazine were what's important is that the editor conceived of artworks not as illustrative companions to literary text, but as meaningful and aesthetically autonomous contributions to the journal. So that there would be featured artists would have a series of 6 pages, such as this one here, an example of one of a double page from a series of drawings by the Lebanese artist Halim Jorda. Next, please, Dan. And this is an example of the work of Juliana Serafim, and it's also from a series of drawings. Next is another example. Yes, and that's another example by of a series of drawing by the Sudanese artist who's actually based in London or Britain now, Ibrahim al-Salahi. And this is drawn from his for the book he has drawn for Tayyib Saleh's book Ars al-Zain, The Wedding of Zain, that in fact was published in 1967 as part of Hiwar's book series and reproduced here in this issue. Hiwar actually set a new model of Arabic literary encounters with the visual and writer-artist collaborations that had its aesthetic legacy on many Arabic cultural publications that followed. But of course, this raises an important question about how to approach Hiwar's important archive. Is it possible to really exorcise from this journal's archive the weighty shadow of the global CIA operation that haunts it? My view is that we need to do so, and we need to move beyond reductive analysis of imperialist machinations that deny historical agency to those locally involved. So we need to assess, in fact, what cultural interventions, such as those of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, entailed in contexts where the so-called Cold War was not cold at all. And just to give a brief context, just 4 years before Hiwar was launched from Beirut, Lebanon witnessed a summer-long armed rebellion in 1958, which occurred, in fact, in the euphoric tide of anti-colonial Arab nationalist movement in the region, especially since the 1956 Suez War. So this revolt was silenced by US military intervention, the first military show of force in the Middle East since World War II, which aimed to ensure that the country did not err on the socialist side of the Cold War divide. It is in this context of US counter-revolutionary foreign policy and related counterinsurgency tactics in Lebanon as in the Global South that we need to situate the covert cultural campaign by way of the Congress of Cultural Freedom, for Cultural Freedom. So using the example of Hiwar, I argue through a long chapter that US cultural campaigns should not be seen as forms of cultural diplomacy, as some have actually framed them, but rather as part and parcel of a multi-pronged counter-insurgency tactics in the Global South. Nonetheless, imperialist intentions do not necessarily issue in the desired outcome. Thus, I suggest that our entry to reading Hiwar should not be the outlook of the CIA, but the aesthetic discourses and political debates of Arab intellectuals and artists in this anti-colonial historical conjuncture. Such a historical framework from below enables us a better understanding of US interventions in the field of Arab political and aesthetic relations and better appreciate Hiwar's legacy. And just as Hiwar, in fact, was bitterly drawing to a close in 1967, other cultural magazines were being launched from Beirut. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. Sha'ar, in particular, or poetry, was preparing its comeback. And we can see through Sha'ar the immediate legacies of Hiwar on Sha'ar's new edition. So for those who don't know Sha'ar, this was an avant-garde modernist poetry periodical that had been launched by the poet Yusuf al-Khal in 1957 in collaboration with the Syrian poet Adonis, and that had been discontinued in 1964. So it resumed publication in 1967 in the slides that in the images slide that you see here. So here you can already see that Sha'ar re-emerged in 1967 with a distinctly new visual approach and a broader engagement with artistic debates and cultural practices, when in its previous edition it had been only confined to poetry and it was mostly textual. So as you see in the slide, this is the work that the Palestinian artist Kamal Boulata designed the cover of Sha'ar and contributed series of drawings to Sha'ar for almost a year. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll see an example of the series of drawing by Kamal Boulata for Sha'ar in that first year. Next slide, please. In fact, Boulata would leave Sha'ar and this is where Waddah Faris, the former art director of Hiwar, would take on the art direction of Sha'ar from then on. So he's designed also the front covers, and again, just like he did in Hiwar, he would introduce and feature the artwork, and in this case you see the work of the Syrian artist Abdul Qadir Arnaout or the Iraqi artist Hashim Samarshi on the cover. And can we go next, please? Yes, and then in this new edition of Sha'ar, Faris also beautifully explores the printed page as a canvas for artistic experimentation, which you can see in this slide and in the next one, please, Dan, as an example. Yeah. All right, and next, please. So I'm just trying to show a bit the legacy of Hiwar in terms of that aesthetic dialogue on the printed page. So here we see, furthermore, that Sha'ar's editor, Yusuf al-Khal, transposed the new visuality of a literary small magazine to the deluxe editions of art books with Dar al-Nahar. These were conceived and marketed as Silsilat al-Nafa'is, or translates as series of precious books that were published between 1967 and 1970. It consisted in a series of carefully curated, revisited, and translated Levantine classics of world literature, ranging from ancient Sumerian text and biblical texts to Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, and published in deluxe art book editions, some of it of limited and numbered and signed. So for this purpose, Al-Khal involved a number of prominent Arab artists to offer modern artistic interpretations of these classics into book form. So you have examples such as collaboration between Unsi el-Hajj, the poet Unsi el-Hajj, and the modern artist Paul Guiragossian. Or you have an example like the one that you see here is that of Dia el-Azawi's drawings for Anis Freyha's editing of epics and legends in Sumerian literature. Next one, please. And you hear that in the next example, you see the work of the artist Shafi Aboud, who does a modern reinterpretation and quite a radical reinterpretation of Maqamat al-Hariri, the celebrated literary Arabic text dating back to the 11th century. Now, yeah, we move on to other examples. Yes, thank you. So these artistic experimentations with the printed page and book form would be politicized with the rise of the Palestinian resistance in the aftermath of the 1967 war, and in a global context of revolutionary anti-imperialism and networks of third worldist or tri-continental solidarity that were across the global south. And indeed, at that time, Beirut's imagined political geography was being redefined as the revolutionary Arab Hanoi, a base and springboard for the liberation of Palestine, just as Hanoi was for South Vietnam. So the politicization of art at this historical juncture brought forth radical artistic experiments with the form of the book. Militant Arab artists strove to democratize art's place within society, and in doing so, hyphenated their art with graphic design practices. The political fervor mobilized many to take up printed media as their canvas for political action. And we need to add to this that there was an availability of advanced reprographics and printing technologies in 1960s and 70s Beirut, which facilitated the reproduction of artwork. In fact, a whole infrastructure and transnational circuits of modern art, literature, translation, and publishing was, and publishing and distribution was put to political use in this revolutionary context. So this is an example that you see here from the Iraqi artist Dia el-Azawi, that is published by the Committee for the Commemoration of Ghassan Kanafani, and it's an artist book that is made a year following Kanafani's assassination. The book consists of 33 black ink drawings inspired by Kanafani's short stories and intended for international dissemination. As you can see, the titles, in fact, on the left side were translated into 7 languages. And here we see that unlike his earlier collaboration with Dar Nahar, there was nothing of the preciousness of the deluxe book edition. This is a small format, standard paperback book, and one that was distributed free of charge. And this is what can be described as artists' books of solidarity that were becoming more prevalent in the 70s by artists such as Dia el-Azawi or other Arab artists. And we need to consider them as political artworks embodied in the public role of the book. And here I borrowed Johanna Drucker's idea of the book as a democratic multiple. I think I have another example next, please, of also a work by Kamal Bulata, who's worked with Sha'ir, but here his work is to accompany Mahmoud Darwish's poem Ahmad al-Za'atar, and that's in solidarity with the victims of the brutal siege and massacre of Palestinian refugees in the Tel al-Za'atar camp in Lebanon. And just one final, I think, next, please. Yes, so this example, it's the important also role of publishing at that time is the example here of the المؤسسة العربية للدراسات والنشر, so the Arab Institute for Research and Publishing. And just to talk about how in the post-1967 revolutionary conjuncture in Beirut became, to borrow the words of George Atiye, the publishing capital of dissident groups. Publishing houses with political motivations proliferated, representing the ideological variants of Arab nationalism and the emerging radical left. So Beirut's new role as a radical node of transnational Arabic publishing was epitomized by the emergence of a very popular idiom from the early 1970s onwards. Egypt writes, Lebanon prints, and Iraq reads. So this is so here the publishing house المؤسسة العربية للدراسات والنشر is in itself symptomatic of the new role Beirut acquired in the early 1970s as a political node in transnational Arabic publishing. This publishing house was founded in 1969 by the Palestinian intellectual Abdul Wahab al-Kayali, who was also an Iraqi citizen and a member of the Iraqi Ba'ath and an activist in the Arab Liberation Front, which was an affiliate organization of the PLO with Arab nationalist and some Ba'ath funding. Al-Mu'assasa went on to publish major works by leading progressive Arab scholars and intellectuals, poets, and novelists. Its overarching anti-colonial and progressive Arab nationalist discourse was not restricted to the textual contents of its publications. It was carried through aesthetically in the form of the book, and that's in the form of the book and its design. And that's thanks to the work of the Egyptian graphic designer and illustrator Hilmi Touni, who was the art director of the leading Cairene publishing establishment, Dar al-Hilal, and its magazine Al-Kawakib during 1960s Nasserist Egypt. In 1974, Touni moved to Beirut and settled there for a decade, during which he was the in-house graphic designer of the Arab Institute, or Mu'assasa. This is exemplary, in fact, of this Cairo-Beirut circuit in Arabic publishing. Though in this transnational circuits of texts, capital, books, and their publishers, the movement of graphic designers connected to the publishing industry has not been given its due attention. And one needs to say that the visuality of these books is no less active in the formation of aesthetic sensibilities and affective horizons than the published text they carry in and through their circulation. And you can see here examples from the work of cover designs by Hilmi Touni. And another, next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So, and this is another sample of his work, which were for children, series children's books. So during his tenure, Hilmi Touni indeed produced a recognizable aesthetic brand for this publishing house. Its visual coherence derives from his particular design approach, which involves modern interpretations of an Arabo-Islamic heritage and Egyptian folk visual culture into book design and illustration. Next, please, just to conclude. Yes, and I'll conclude with the example of, in fact, a radical publishing house for children. For those who don't know it, this is Dar al-Fata al-Arabi. It was the first Arabic publishing house for children that was, in fact, launched from Beirut in 1974, that was affiliated with the PLO's Palestine Planning Center. The project was born out of the necessity for an alternative education commensurate with the revolutionary moment. In this context, Palestinian and Arab children's affective and imaginative realms posed a particular concern for this emerging publishing house. Dar al-Fata aimed to decolonize children's literature in terms of knowledge, aesthetics, and imagination, and to instill a revolutionary consciousness among the youth. It was also, if we can go to the next, no, not yet, actually, just, it's fine. It was also a node of transnational solidarity that brought on board Arab artists, writers, and intellectuals who have been committed in their solidarity with the Palestinian struggle to revolutionary change in the Arab world. Among these were artists, Arab artists from Syria, such as in the example that you've just seen before of Burhan Karkutli, drawings for the children of Ghassan Kanafani. There's also from Syria, Yusuf Abdelki and Nazir Nab'a, who have contributed artworks for this publishing house. But also Dar al-Fata relied overwhelmingly on the labor of the 1960s generation of Egyptian illustrators and political cartoonists for the Egyptian press. And here, key among these is Muhyiddin al-Labbad, who relocated also to Beirut, just like Helmi Touni in 1974. But he relocated to join Dar al-Fata in its formative years as its art director, and taking over, in fact, from Kamal Bulata. He was joined by other Egyptian artists, such illustrators, Ahmed Hijazi, Mahmoud Fahmi, Adli Rizallah, and Bahjat Osman, some of whom you see also in their work you see in the slide, and also Helmi Touni contributed as well to them. So this is yet another Cairo-Beirut circuit of publishing that needs to be acknowledged in this particular publishing house. And I will just end here by just saying that, concluding by saying that it's through examining this rich archive of post-colonial Arabic publishing that it enables us to write an alternative history of Arab decolonization processes away from the official Arab nation-state discourses, and one that challenges imperialist machinations and reductive historiographies of the Cold War. Thank you very much. And did I make it in 20 minutes?
Yes, you did.
Thank you, Zeina.
We forgot to say that if anyone has questions, please type them in the Q&A and we'll group them and we'll address them to the speakers in the next section of this.
So we are going to play the video presentation now, which I am hoping will work well. I think Hannah will tell me if it's not, and we will try to make it work if it's not working, but we'll play it now. So.
We are Fehras Publishing Practices, an artist collective established in Berlin in 2015. Our group is researching the history and presence of publishing and its entanglement in the socio-political and cultural sphere in the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Arabic diaspora. The main focus of our work aims to explore the interrelation between politics, culture, and publishing, and to trace the role of publication as a medium for knowledge production and as a space for critical reflection upon political and historical narration. What brought the collective into being is a growing friendship, as well as a similar reading of the region's past and present through the archive of publishing. Within the research, topics such as collective labor, gender identity, migration, autonomy, language dominance, and funding flow. We investigate in public libraries and book markets. We search private collections and collections of institutions. We trace publishers and dig into university catalogs, as well as journalistic, radio, and television archives. Private histories of intellectuals, memoirs, letters, and photographs are a crucial part of our interest. We are taking you now on an archival research journey we at Fehras Publishing Practices undertook over the last 2 years between Beirut, Damascus, and Berlin. It's a journey through which we delved into Middle Eastern and North African macrocosmos of the Cold War and their cultural life during the 1950s and 60s. We will tell you stories of figures whose tracks we followed, and of global institutions that either openly or covertly supported cultural projects that served their policies. Since the beginning of our collective work, we have had an exciting relationship to the archive. Throughout different projects, these mahfouzat, records, as Kamal Abu Deeb named in his translation of Culture and Imperialism by Edward Said, were and continue to be the main source from which we draw information, study and question the history. Therefore, we are constantly collecting materials, classifying them, questioning them, transforming them, and creating out of these materials fictions and stories. It must be said that through these experiences, we learned that our relation to records is thorny and has two sides. The first is when you smile after discovering a precious publication sleeping on a hidden shelf. And the other side is when you feel grieved over the loss of a book or the destruction of space caused by war, violence, or by recklessness. Perhaps the status of disappearance and reappearance, which we were observing in our project when the library was stolen, a project studied and catalogued the private library of the novelist Abdulrahman Munif, contains these two contradictions: the excitement of discovering the record, but also the mourning and acceptance of loss that we experience as culture producers who work and come from that region. It seems that we need to deal with this status, or at best considering it as a derive for our work, a topic for our discussions, or as a puzzle we need to rearrange its parts in order to let it grow or be born again. In fact, our interest in examining the archives of the Cultural Cold War was developed through discussions in which we came to believe there existed common denominators between cultural practices back then and today. These commonalities are particularly striking if we consider how this era witnessed the dawn of the globalization of culture in the Arab region, which had become intertwined in international networks of political capital, whether personal, public, regional, or global. We consider the Cold War era was among the most fertile and critical periods in the history of Arab culture and publishing, because it entangled politics with culture production. World War II had drawn to an end, and some Arab countries had achieved independence, while new era regimes had seized power. These changes aligned sharply with a range of ideologies: communism and Marxism, leftist liberalism, Syrian or pan-Arab nationalism, Nasserism and Baathism, that indelibly marked Arab culture and publishing. The rivals in the bipolar world order, the United States and the Soviet Union, each pursued policies of a cultural hegemony that implicated international politics in cultural and publishing practices. In this bipolar order, each superpower established institutions and funded a network of international endeavors, making the Middle East and North Africa integral to the Cultural Cold War. As these changes unfurled, Arab cultural production and publishing were transforming radically from within. New literary styles and ideas emerged during this period. Some were influenced by trends in Western philosophy, such as realism, which adopted the idea of iltizam, or literally commitment, and the notion of art in the service of society, while modernist intellectuals became concerned with the self and with literature for literature's sake. At the core of these movements were publishers, writers, poets, and translators, some of whom established collectives and regularly held seminars, or who launched initiatives, publications, publishing houses, and other institutions. These figures maneuvered between international foundations and publishing houses, espousing a positional political, drawing them together in a web of collaboration, of friendship and love. Pursuing these lines of inquiry, we dug into archives from the 50s and the 60s, such as books, magazines, memoirs, personal letters, newspaper articles, and photographs. From some random issues of the propaganda magazine Soviet Union that the collector Aboudi Abu Jawdi offered to us from his rich and open archive, when talking about the Soviet publications, we came to know the story of the Soviet book empire, Progress Publishers. Progress Publishers was the embodiment of the centralization of publishing as followed by the Soviet Union to promote communist ideology and Soviet culture. It was a massive institution established in 1963 by the Soviet Ministry of Culture in Moscow and merged the foreign language publishing house with the foreign literature publishing house. Progress Publishers was charged with translating and publishing political, literary, and academic writings in over 15 global languages, including Arabic. And its various publications were issued in 2 million copies. Syria was the main import of Progress publications starting in the 60s. And as a generation raised in the 80s, we were already familiar with its children's books. Yet, our understanding of Progress Publishers in the Soviet publishing became sharp after our visit to the library of the Russian Cultural Center in the neighborhood Verdun in Beirut. We entered hoping to find these books, and it was a big surprise to find a large selection of Progress publications from different times, and until its closure in 1991. Within seconds, we became beehives workers spreading out between the library's shelves to photograph and document all covers and the books that's relevant to our research. In opposing to a big Soviet publishing house, the Americans had to create their way a new model that would allow entry to the core of the Arab culture elite and to the general public. This model was embodied in Franklin book programs. While documenting the library of Abdurrahman Munif, we found many books published by these institutions. Franklin had succeeded to occupy a large space in the libraries of Arab intellectuals. It was founded in New York in 1952, and its publications were distributed worldwide in what is known today as the Global South, from Indonesia to Iran to parts of the Arab world to Latin America. During the Cold War, Franklin funded the publication of American translations and training programs in editing, book production, and library science. Franklin drew in the best Arab translators to promote American writings and supported Arab publishing houses in Egypt, Lebanon, and Iraq by purchasing original authors' rights and sometimes paying the cost of design, printing, and distribution. In contrast to progress publishers, Franklin marginalized its central role of furthering an agenda in an attempt to conceal its part in the cultural war. Instead, it pushed local publishers to the forefront, playing the role of intermediary between them and American publishers. With the start of the Cold War was the establishment of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an American institution that was active internationally. It was based in Paris following a huge conference in West Berlin in 1950 that brought together intellectuals from Western states and America to defend cultural freedom from communism. This institution spread worldwide via its global offices. While it planned conferences, offered study grants, and published culture magazines such as Encounter in England, Verve in France, The Monad in Germany, Tempo Presente in Italy, Mondo Nuevo in Latin America, Black Orpheus in Nigeria, Quest in India, and Hiwar that was published in Beirut. The institution never revealed the source of its funding until a series of articles were published in the New York Times in 1966, exposing its funding as coming from the Central Information Agency CIA, which was a public scandal for the intellectuals of that period who worked for it. The Congress for Cultural Freedom opened its first office in Beirut in 1954, followed by a Cairo office in 1959. And these two offices formed the headquarters of its work in the region. The cultural magazine Hiwar was one of the most important projects it worked on it in the Arab region. We learned about these various stages of developing this magazine through letters exchanged in the 1960s between Joan Hunt in Paris, Simone Jargi, the operation manager in Asia, and Jamil Jabber, the director of the Beirut office. Our archival journey brought us to another project on the margins of the cultural Cold War that took place in tandem with the publishing movement of the Soviet Union and the United States. This was the Afro-Asian Writer Association, which was launched in Tashkent in 1958, with support from countries participating in the 1955 Bandung Conference. Influenced by the non-aligned movement, the Afro-Asian Writer Association sought to strengthen the spirit of cooperation between people of Asia and Africa. Its permanent bureau was initially established in Colombo, and its operations moved to Cairo in 1967 due to its geographical proximity to sub-Sahara Africa. This office continued to function until 1978, when it was moved to Beirut following the signing of the Camp David Accord. Many Arab intellectuals whose name we encountered during this research were active in this association. Suhail Idris, founder of Al-Adab magazine, the poets Nazik al-Malaika, Adonis and Badr Shakir al-Sayyab, the political writer Hussein Mrouwi, literary critic Ghali Shukri, and others. The association called for bolstering publishing in African and Asian countries. In 1967, it launched Lotus magazine, headed by editor Youssef Sibai in Cairo. Lotus was a quarterly originally published as Afro-Asian Writings until its sixth issue, published in 1970 when its name was changed to Lotus. It published translations of contemporary African and Asian literature and was issued in two versions, one Arabic and the other English and French. The magazine was significant for its role in creating cultural relations between Asian writers and those from the South in opposing to colonialism and new colonialism. During the 2 years of research, we acquired and collected materials such as newspapers, book covers, letters, memoirs, documents, and photographs. The research was followed by a process of indexing, classifying, and commenting on that collected archive. Therefore, we presented these material through different stages. We developed fictional stories out of the archive as a way to raise critical questions about the historical narrative that the archive itself is telling, but also as a way to avoid the trap in which we could fall while working with the material. Name it nostalgia, name it presenting facts and claiming knowledge. The idea of the photo novel is not merely developing a fictional story from an archive, but is to bring the world and the practice of Fehras, us as individual and collective, into the story. We wanted to experience and confront the power of history and its narrative on our own bodies. Hala Haddad, Afaf Samra, Huda El-Wadi are the protagonists of this story. They meet together in Beirut in the 1960s and become friends and interact with historical figures and work for international institutions. We chose also to play the role of three women since we had the feeling that the historical narrative in general is dominated by masculinity. Playing these roles was also to bring our queerness into the past with the attempt to tell a side of a story that had been neglected or untold. The performativity within the photo novel is trying to go beyond the performance of characters. It aims to perform the archive itself. The whole scenes we created were included with our findings. Covers, posters, books, props, letters, objects we wanted to be situated in this location or that, to highlight this topic or that. We used the archive to create the world in which our three women, the collective of Fehras, became themselves an archive that is interacting with the collected one. An archive that moves back and forth in history without any temporal and historical limitation.
So thank you very much for that video presentation. And I'm going to pass over to Hannah now, who's going to follow up with some questions.
Thank you, Dan. Maybe we'll start with asking you both the same question. First to Fehras, could you maybe tell us more about the upcoming exhibition you have in Mosaic Rooms and how it connects to some of the themes you have discussed here? And then maybe ask the same question to Zeina in a different way, because I mean, before reading this book, many of us knew Zeina as a designer, as a curator, as an author. We've seen your projects take different shapes, shape-shifting, to go back to the first session with Ala and Maha. So will this work take another shape at some point, maybe an exhibition or something else? Maybe we'll start with Fehras, because you need to share.
Yeah, okay. First, thank you, Hannah and Dan, for the invitation and this opportunity to talk. And thank you, Zeina, also for the beautiful presentation. Yeah, the exhibition at the Mosaic Rooms. We are also connecting the background, the historical research with our relation to archive. And the exhibition will be consisting from three parts. I will be talking about the first part, and maybe later Omar and Kinan will speak about the other parts. And the first part will be focusing on the visualization of our archive collected for the project Beirut Faces since 2018. This visualization of the archive will take the shape of a digital library. I think Omar will put some slideshows. A digital library. And since we are understanding publishing practices in their relation to the political and cultural domains, the observation of archiving practices and cataloging systems and their political dimensions became also a part of our investigations. In the wake of the digitization of archives and libraries, we are looking into new tendencies in how institutions and universities making specific inventories accessible to research aims. We are also observing the shift of their cataloging strategies. This movement bringing questions about the ownership of the archive and new ways of writing histories. Therefore, we found ourselves more and more interested in the role played by library catalogs in defining knowledge hierarchies and classifying pacts and their relation to institutional frames and policies. Within the exhibition, we decided to make our collected and curated archive of Beirut Faces accessible to the readers by exploring the digitization of our own collected materials, archival materials. For the mosaic room, we developed a digital space, so to say, through which the viewers could search various of entities. I mean by entities, authors, publishers, magazines, institutions, translators, etc., and amount of commented archival materials related to each entity. We are commenting on all the archive that we are collecting. And this visualization offers also the possibility of exploring the contextual connection between these entities. To explain more, we are talking, for example, about connections between intellectuals, cultural institutions, journals, collectives, groups, and funders. And these connections aims to graphically present the complexity of cultural production and the interrelation between politics, culture, and funding on a global level. A very exciting aspect of this digital library is tagging, and the digital library will be highlighting tagging as a system or a possibility for giving new meanings and recreating the archival materials. In this digital space, we defined already various tags for the materials, like globalized identities, presentation trap, colonial approach, cultural agency, solidarity confusion, and so on. And the visitors of the website are also invited to add their own tags or keywords that they would associate with each document they search. And by using this tagging system as a way for creating a new connection and meaning for our own archive. The tagging is aiming as well to question the ownership of the historical narrative. Another aspect of visualization of the archive of Beirut Faces is that we wanted to address the shifting of boundaries between the resources and the archival object. We are proposing the resource as part of the archive, so that the collectors, such as university libraries or private collectors like our friend Aboudi Abu Jawdi and other influential individuals who played a crucial role in our investigations, become a part of their archives and the artist became part of their research. They become equivalent at the end to the historical entity because both equally are having an impact on creating the historical narrative. This digital format is an attempt to flatten the hierarchy within the archive and between the collector and the collection. A further step, we decided to integrate our three fictional figures that you saw in the presentation in the video, Huda, Hala, and Afaf. We are integrating these three fictional figures in the archive as an attempt to break the fixation on the facts through the historical document. This will be the first part of the exhibition, the introduction for the visitor of the exhibition, this journey with the archival materials. And the second space will be...
Yeah, I can tell you a bit about it. Yeah, like the second part of the exhibition will focus on performing the archive within the format of the photo novels, which connect fiction with the historical narration. As we said before, like 2 years ago, we published World Faces #1. Can you see the photos right now? I think you're still in the...
We can see the bookshelf on a yellow background, or the cabinet. Okay.
Now
we can see the photos, yes.
Okay, cool, perfect. Yeah, like 2 years ago, we issued World Face #1. It's a photo novel that tells a story around publishing culture in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa during the Cold War era. The photo novel presents a fictional character of three women, Hala, Huda, and Afaf. These three meet together in Beirut in the 60s and become friends with each other, work with the local and international institutions, and interact with historical figures like the displaced intellectual writers and translators from Palestine who were in Beirut at that time. We choose to play the role of these three women since we had this feeling that the historical narrative in general is dominated by masculinity. This photographic work, maybe we can show next. Yeah. This photographic work aims to perform the archive as an imagined space, and the choice of bringing these historical places into the play of imagination was because the role of these places in disseminating knowledge, in gathering books and intellectual, and their role as spaces for generating cultural policies. Yeah.
So as we, like, for example, we see in the pictures that we are showing now, we are in this space, we were focusing on the office of the Franklin Foundation in Beirut, and showing the interaction between our figure Afaf Samra and some of the figures who were working mainly for this office, such as Samira Azzam and Mahmoud Yusuf Najm and Hassan Abbas.
Yeah.
Also, other spaces appears in the photo novels. For example, we also focus on the Beirut reduction office of the Soviet Union magazine, and maybe we can show also, which is
stop, and it's where
it's. I mean, I can
here.
No, this is Sharq. Yeah, it's okay.
Right.
So
you have to go to Zoom.
And you're no longer sharing your screen.
Okay. Now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for example, this is the space also of Afaf Samara, which is Al-Sharq bookshop. And generally, this performativity of spaces aims to go beyond just the performance of characters within a scenic surrounding. It's aimed to perform the archive itself. So the whole scenes in the photographs are based on our archival materials, fragments such as original photographs, books and book covers, props, oral telling, photo notes, letters. So we use the archive to create a sort of world of imagined spaces, so to speak. So where different archives hits each other to create an imagined world. We want as a collective to create and to be also in this archive, a world created by archival fragments that located beyond any rigid temporal and historical vision. So basically, the photo novel we're going to be presented in the exhibition in photographs in one of the spaces. And I'm just going to talk shortly about the third part of, if we still have time, just briefly, 1 minute or 2 minutes. So this is the third part of the exhibition, is we'll be focusing on also taking the whole protagonist to a third journey. We called it like the future recall. We will take our protagonists, Hala and Huda and Afaf, to the archive, to the deposit of the archive of the CCF at the University of Chicago, and where we had in the last period, we tried to study the online catalog of the CCF that was created in 2014. And throughout this, like the study of this online catalog, we tried to use it as an instruction to rebuild an imagined space and to create a like a playful hub for our collective to be in. So what we do, we decided to involve these three characters in a journey where the figures going from the 60s to the present, and this journey would be shown in the exhibition in photographic works, like a large-scale photographs that show this journey where the three women go to the deposit, they would steal the archive, and then escaping with the archive on a magic carpet in order to escape the institutional frames, to go out to a kind of a safe space where they reorder this archive, suggest new keywords to maybe as we consider it as a kind of reorganization of this catalog and extending the research, including other topics that has never been highlighted in this archive, such as global identities, intersectionality, cultural representation, political neutrality, where the main aim of it is also to extend the research topics within this archive that is disclosed within this catalog. Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe further that I would like to add also, it is a question about who is the creator of a catalog, which is the provider of the knowledge. And especially when we take, Zeina already mentioned shortly, the history of SAF as a multi-dimensional global institution that through the years dealt with different cultures and languages. So the question also for us today, how can we create a catalog, provide orientations for researchers, for artists, for students, for who is interested out of the structure of the institution.
Thank you for that. You've really touched on some of the key questions of why we started this series, and especially that Dan and I are coming at this from the worlds of libraries and archives. Can't wait to see the exhibition personally, especially it will be in a time when London is hopefully opening up. What you said also echoes what Robin, a comment that Robin put in the Q&A. I'm not sure if everyone else can see it, but it's that both presentations have made her reflect on the practices of libraries, whether is it not collecting children's books or removing the book covers when saving them in the library. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of that. Zeina, just to remind you of the question, it's about the different shape-shifting that your project will take on, and then maybe I'd like to add Ammar's question to that because it's relevant. Ammar says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. How do you bring this rich history to the awareness of people so we can build on it? I feel little is done in this sphere, and these pieces of history bring so much hope and courage. At times we find lesser and lesser artists and writers publishing in Arabic.
Yes, thanks Ammar for the question. And also it's really been fascinating to hear Fehras's presentation about their work, and I'm really looking forward to your exhibition and to the graphic novel to read the stories and how you interpret that history. I think your question, Hannah, is where I'm coming from in terms of this project. So having been a graphic designer and an academic in graphic design, and began my journey through the first project on the political posters of the Civil War. Initially, it was almost like an activist project that led me to become a historian. So the archive, I actually abandoned my art or design practice to become the historian, and more interested in the archive as a document, as a historical document. So what I did previously with the political posters, and I think that's relevant to the questions, is that I had an exhibition, and eventually was a website that is cataloged, in which you can actually look at signs of conflict, in which you can look into the search and use an archive of actually not just a forgotten history of Lebanon's civil war, but as an erased one, officially erased by a state of amnesia, and all the warlords, in fact, being in government after the end of the war, which we have been seeing the repercussions of in the latest in the last year, and revolts against that. So that sort of history is very, Ammar's question is very important, because I think, yes, the question of how these archives and the way that they are accessible, and the way that one can actually begin to even build collections, like having worked with Aboudi for years to actually locate every single item, it's a labor of, it's a huge amount of work. And it's a labor of love and commitment to this, to being, and in fact, there's activism involved in doing this when you don't have an institutional structure. So there is a commitment also. So as I moved to become a scholar and more of a historian through this new book and new project, I'm also still committed to making the material more accessible. And definitely through different forms of public interactions. So one idea is that's something I've been discussing for a long time with Aboudi, about an exhibition of this material. So the book my recent book is not just about publishing, it's about different forms of printed matter, from cards to brochures to posters. But there is a significant portion of it on publishing, and we'd like to have an exhibition, and the possibility of having a traveling exhibition, something where between Beirut and London is something that I'm beginning to plan and think about now that the book is over. So it wasn't possible to do all of these things at the same time. But I think my treatment and relation to this material is different than actually your free use of it, and that's interesting, that discussion of how. So I think so that would be an exhibition of this material, but also to try to digitize this material and to try to build digital platforms and of these archives and these collections. And it's something that I'm hoping to be able to build with partners, and because I've learned the hard lesson of working on the previous political posters website, that it really needs to be, I'm more and more convinced that such archives need to be part of institutional framework somehow, to have a longevity and sustainability on the longer term. And that's one way to render them more visible and accessible, and that depends of also the other problem, whether institutions are willing to do that, and sometimes that's the problem we face in how to bring this material to a public domain, but also how to have interactions with people around this material through workshops, with students, or with people. I mean, in the sense that, yes, I think the question of Ammar, we're disconnected from that history, and it's a history that gives us hope still. I think history, generally reading history, is always something that inspires hope. And being able to look at the material culture of a particular moment of revolution that has been forgotten. Today we look there's been a lot of concern since the 10 years now anniversary of revolutions or attempts or uprisings in the Arab world. And also with what's going on with Palestine, which today also, despite all the difficulties, inspires hope in that sense of continued resistance. Looking back at these historical moments is important to also look at the role of artists, relations in collaborations between artists and intellectuals, with artists and authors, and a sense of commitment, not in the conventional state idea or hijacking of the idea of iltizam or commitment, but actually a much more. There's a sense of active political sort of struggle and hope, and building a future that can be radical, and dreaming of an alternative future. And then I think this visual material, the visuality of this publishing material, is so important in being able to illustrate these hopes and ideas clearly. It's not words only that are in text that actually inspires hope. It's also some of these imagined futures that some of these artists have drawn, and to whom they spoke to children as the future, right? And I think that's such an important commitment. Yeah, so I think, did I answer the questions? Yeah, stop here.
You answered in a very nice way.
Thank you.
Dan, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, so you've answered a part of Huda's question about the sustainability of private archives by mentioning their kind of constraints, but I was really intrigued that you're both drawing from some of the same private archives, and especially Aboudi's, and I wanted you to maybe expand on that a bit more and describe to the audience who might not have experienced this archive, haven't interacted with it, what it's like, what it contains, the person behind it, if there's a possibility to do that at all, to kind of bring it to life somewhat.
Aboudi is here.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to figure out to freaking.
If there is a way to bring him into the conversation.
If anyone knows, they can tell us in the chat how we can bring. Yeah, he just raised his hand.
I see. I'm allowing him to talk.
Wow, look at that.
So,
I don't know if he's able to mute or unmute.
Yeah.
I've personally known, if he can speak, that's great. If not, I can just say that I've personally met Aboudi from actually almost, I don't know, I'm not going to count the years, but since working on my previous posters project. And this is where we discovered that we have that mutual interest. And since then, is he able to, has his hand up? Since then, we've been in collaboration and trying to build. So his collection is continuously building, and he has also another collection which we don't actually talk about here, is the Egyptian cinema posters. I think it's one of the biggest collection of posters and press books of Egyptian and Arab cinema, in fact. Aboudi, can you unmute? It's not working, I think.
While we're waiting for Aboudi to possibly unmute, Fehras, I was just wondering, again, maybe you can also reflect on your use of that archive and other private archives as well that you've kind of engaged with in your
engaging with the archive. You mean in general, or for a specific? You mean or also in this connection to Aboudi?
Yeah, in this connection to Aboudi, but also in general. I mean, there's obviously a very big difference between engaging with big institutional archives and private archives, and also the kind of qualitative and quantitative differences there, and what you kind of gain from a private archive that you might not kind of gain from a kind of almost a faceless institutional archive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the private history of the collector, the biography of the author that we are researching, his private collection, it became in a way or another impacting our understanding and the produced knowledge. So back to an old project, the research that we made on the private library of Abdurrahman Munif, we documented his library. We ended up understanding different strategies and methods by publishing houses that were established and worked in specific political conditions and disappeared at a later stage, following their traces through a private collection like Abdurrahman Munif, who was a modernist and who was a leftist and who left also the politics to concentrate on literature, but his literature was very political at the same time. And you see how the collection is growing up, and you start raising questions about his interests, and if these interests are telling about reflecting the publishing movement, or it is private interests. And this is open I think open the horizon for the researcher to see this history from different perspectives.
Yeah, and in general, like, I mean, also the relationship with a collector or with an institution is completely different, because usually the interpersonal relationship with a collector, for example, or with a small bookshop or a book vendors is completely different. It's based on really a kind of a human relationship that where the discussions about the material that a person or a small bookshop has, it's completely influencing the way we are researching the material, but also the kind of just like the coincidence of being in a space, searching, having some information from the person, also the trust that a person would give you in relation to your research, and how you get the trust from the person. It's also influence the material in the end that you get from, and also it's also about the negotiation about what you're going to do with the material, because most of the collectors, most of private people, most of the private person, they are also interested in what you are doing with the material, because they are collecting it for a reason, and they want actually to be sure that this material is being used in a way that is being respected, the material that they collected for years and years.
Yeah, also like someone like Abu Dawood, he's like really generous, and like he's open like his space. And I remember like we spent like weeks making like scans for a lot of stuff, and this is like totally not possible in libraries from universities. And so it's have like a big influence about the transformation of the archive, like from the archive resource to our archive. Yeah.
Okay, I think I've managed to unmute Aboudi, but I mean, it's absolutely fair. He wasn't expecting to speak after all, so it's fine. If he wants to join in, it's absolutely fine. But you mentioned bookshops, and there was a question in the chat, Fehras, about distribution of your work. You know, how do you distribute it? How do you sell it? And I think this question was specifically about, is it available in the United States? So again, this kind of question behind distribution and publishing, which is one that's historical, but another one that's also at the same time contemporary in terms of your practice.
Interestingly, like the first maybe acquisitions of the publications comes from librarians from American universities. And maybe with our friends that they support by buying, and some private requests. But we know it. We don't make. It's about talking about the work and performing the work or the publication in different situations, occasions. But the distribution, it's online, and it's not. Now we are distributing through this.
We are
talk.
doing everything about ourselves. Right?
May also, like, this is maybe not an inductor, but since the announcement of the exhibition at the Musée Crew and the residency at the Delfina Foundation, we got 3 requests. I don't know, people in England now are interested, which is really nice, and this is exciting for us to.
Yeah, and it's available on our website. So this it's available on our website. So the orders.
Yeah, no, I think that's how I first became aware of your work and was in touch with you, was through buying your work from the library. But also when I posted it on Instagram, my friends in Berlin, one of them works at Mobile, was just like, oh yeah, I know. It's like this kind of personal / professional kind of so I just wanted to kind of ask also, so Huda Abi Faris had a question, how do you define the decolonizing aspect of publishing in Beirut and its ramifications on publishing in Beirut today? What can we learn from the historical practices for the future of publishing in Lebanon and the Arab world? That was specifically directed towards Zeina, but I think it's maybe also something that Fehras can answer as well. So maybe Zeina, if you want to go first on that question, decolonizing and the decolonial in your research.
Well, I think that in the last couple of years, we've been seeing this decolonial turn, and a lot of it sometimes is either metaphoric or it's a reference to an epistemological sort of change and about knowledge production. But what I'm concerned with is histories of decolonization, but that in fact can inform us about how to change our perspectives and knowledge production. So these histories of decolonization are important in the sense that it's actually, again, coming to my conclusion that it's not something that is the formal, it's a process, and we know that it is an ongoing process and an unfinished one in certain cases, and it's not something that can be defined by the sort of the official state independence. Basically, there are so many other layers of processes of decolonization. Some have termed them eventually neocolonial, or and that affect other dimensions. Some economic, but also what I'm trying to talk about is cultural, what I'm trying to do is, in fact, to shift the discussion. So when we're talking about a Cold War, what is the Cold War in a place such as Beirut, or in other places of the global South at that time, when it was perceived as a very hot war? It was actually moments of national liberation, of decolonization struggles, that some of it, in fact, actually took up arms as means of struggle. So they were in that sense quite very, very hot. And they were active wars, but there was a cultural dimension to all this that we kind of miss. And I am wary of the use of the Cold War as an umbrella framework, because if we look at it from our side of the world, that's actually not how it was perceived. So even for magazines such as Hiwar, it's important to situate the different actors and contributors within debates that were taking place at that time, within really very vicious debates around what is Arab modernism at that time, how is part of a decolonization process or not, a decolonization struggle as a means for liberation. What does liberation means if we're thinking about it from that perspective versus what actually the Congress for Cultural Freedom is trying to impose as individual freedom. So I think it's sometimes we don't do justice to some of these actors and artists who actually had different agendas, and it's their agendas were part of a modernist project that was entangled with processes of decolonization. Whether they agreed that art and literature should be part of that political struggle or not is an internal disagreement. How they were co-opted as part of a broader a global imperial campaign is something else. So I think it's a complex relation between external funding that has imperialist motives and what the actors on the ground were doing within their own political processes and specifically within processes of cultural decolonization, which actually took language, questions of translation, took questions around identity, questions about self-affirmation, dignity. All of these came into were key issues that informed different approaches to art and design and to publishing as well. And that's why they came together. And that's why, in fact, we see that some of the actors that were, in fact, involved in projects such as Hiwar, I'm just thinking of an example here, Zakaria Tamer, who wrote for Hiwar, right? Zakaria Tamer eventually, by the end of the decade, or just like in the 70s, was crucial to Dar al-Fatah al-Arabi, which was a radical project. So these people actually were not just dupes to some sort of international machination and funding, external funding. And I think that's the issue of today as well. Has its own agenda, but people who are on the ground have also their own politics. So it's not to undermine this, but there's some things shift. And again, contingencies actually matter. Let's not think of some of these actors as fixed in time in relation to the CIA's ideas, but they have their own trajectories and own motivations and cultural projects that go with it. Decolonization, again, culturally, in terms of publishing, is just think that Algeria at that time was just moving to Arabize. So, and Beirut was a key space in which that production and translation and circulation distribution was happening. So language is one thing, but also all other visions of the future are important to such cultural projects.
And for Fehras, on the same question about the decolonial and decolonization in your work, how do you view that? Or is it something that's important to you, or is it something you just do as a matter of nature, really?
Of course, I mean, I would just, like Zeina, I really answered like big part of the question, yeah, we share a bit of what you're saying, and would you just add that we, for example, in our project, if it's Borrowed Faces, that and maybe not just focusing on the term of Cold War, just like Borrowed Faces in itself is concerning with the topic of globalization, what we called the early form of globalization and the second form of globalization that maybe in the beginning around the 50s was concerned with a way of like focusing on translation, on the translation of that was brought to the so-called Eastern Mediterranean North Africa from institutions such as Progress House or Franklin Foundation. And it's in the second part of the globalization where we're talking about the intervention of institutions such as the CCF. But in general, of course, this is part of the discussion. But on the other hand, we're talking about the complexity of the relationship between intellectual and institution, the complexity of the relationship between the intellectual and the different ideologies, also the movement that it's never, the history is never a linear thing. Like we also addressing this topic because it's related to our current situation, our present, because if we compare the economy of contemporary art, it's not so far from the situation that we can address and talk about in the 60s. So this economy of the relationship between intellectual or between the artist and the funding system, and if we are talking about the global or a local perspective, it's also super complicated. And in the beginning of our project, we were super critical in observing specific intellectual figures, but with the time we could.
Sorry, like Tawfiq, sorry, like the published Hiwar.
Yeah, Tawfiq Sayer or Badr Shakir as-Sayyab, where we can see that their biography is never like a linear biography, how history is actually presented, but it's more or less, it's like a contradiction that we, each one of us would live. But that's why also one of the aspects of our project where we were talking about the movement inside the cultural scene in Beirut, for instance. So to say that to try to separate just the colonial aspect or the global aspect from what's happening inside on a local level. So do you want to add something?
Yeah, amazing what you're saying, but also I think it's a consideration to look at the 60s as a decade that had two different political conditions. I think the defeat of the Arabs in 1967 also categorized the whole cultural scene. And this also explains why some writers, authors, artists also, that they were more to the liberal, so to say, movement, that you saw them in the other direction totally, or the way around, like and there's some examples, like when we
for example, if we consider talking about Sha'r and Hiwar, Sha'r and Al-Adab as two contradictory magazines with two different ideologies, and then we see one intellectual that is writing here and there, and Hiwar later. So it's not it's super hard to put people in one position and in one direction, because it's not simple as the history actually also presents.
I think that's a really good point to conclude on, that these kind of binaries that we might create in our kind of research or our practices aren't always so binary after all. These are quite messy, entangled, enmeshed histories. So on that point, I'm sorry we haven't had enough time to answer all the questions that were posed. We've run out of time and we've gone over. And I would like to thank you on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of Hannah, who couldn't stay until the end because of the prior appointment. So in the absence of an audience, I just want to give you all a round of applause. Zeina and Fehras, who I'm really looking forward to your exhibition at the Mosaic Rooms, but also the kind of speculative, hopefully will happen in the future, exhibition of Zeina and Aboudi, who could join us, and take some space here as well. That was really good. So I just want to announce before the end that our next talk and final talk in the series will be on the 8th of June at the same time. And that's with Refka Abu Rumaila and Christine Khouri. And they will be speaking about their respective projects. So Refka on a database for Palestinian literature, and Christine on her project, which was with Russia Salty, reflections on the digital futures of past disquiet. So thank you very much again, and
thank you very much for your
attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone, and thanks everyone for joining.
See you soon,
See you soon. Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.